Thank you. Thank you. And welcome to the second part of day one, the afternoon. And I'm going to be introducing the two speakers for this particular session before we take another break for coffee. And when we put this together, Claudette and I did not know that Matt Farish had done his degree with Derek Gregory at UBC in geography. So Matt is a geographer. He's at the University of Toronto. I first heard about him following the publication of his first book on the contours of the Cold War. It was given to me by friends of his parents on a ferry in British Columbia between Tsawwassen and Main Island, and they said, "Oh, you're interested in these things. We can't understand a word of this book, but perhaps you would like it." And I did like it. I liked it very much. It's an extraordinary book. And so I was very grateful to receive it and reported back to them accordingly. Matt's next book is on a history of the Jew line. It is wonderful to have him here speaking to us. Matt Farish.
Hello, everybody. I'm really delighted to be here and to see so many familiar faces from near and far. I'd like to extend a big thank you to Claudette and her crew for all of the organizational work, and of course to John and Sophie and their collaborators for such a fascinating and important exhibition. I'm also pleased, and as John implied, a little bit amused to be sharing this session with my mentor and friend Derek. I first saw Derek speak 21 years ago, which is a long time. In an introductory geography course, Derek knows very much how that experience completely changed my life. I will just state that you're in for a treat, notwithstanding the grim subject material. So when I visited the AGO a couple of months ago, I lingered over several corners of Camera Atomica. The concentric circles of destruction over central Toronto, the sickening depictions of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the hours after their destruction, the bizarre Life magazine depictions of twisted, charred civil defense mannequins. And in different ways, these are all images of post-atomic landscapes, okay? I will. In different ways, these are all images of post-atomic landscapes. Maps, cities, homes, and bodies violently reconfigured. And the immediacy of this transformation is well suited to the momentary fix offered by camera, particularly in the case of nuclear tests, as a book like Michael Light's remarkable photographic essay, 100 Suns, confirms. There's a wall of reproductions from 100 Suns scattered in the AGO on one wall. And amongst those images are also photographs that hint at the attempts on the part of the United States Department of Defense to understand and even harness this dramatic, immediate transformation, to fold it within the familiar language and performance of war. These attempts are even more visible in the Camera Atomica catalog and in Light's own book, with its meticulous notes on the specifications of each rehearsal, to borrow Rebecca Solnit's term. So today I want to start, at least, with one of these rehearsals. Early in the morning of November 1st, 1951, some 2,800 Army troops from 4 different units gathered in the dusty desert basin of Yucca Flat at the eastern edge of the Nevada Proving Grounds. They were there to witness a nuclear test codenamed Dog, the 4th in the series known as Buster Jangle. In the minutes before the detonation, a PA system issued a reassuring announcement. The soldiers were in a safe location, about 7 miles away, and any danger from radiation would dissipate after 90 seconds. In fact, with simple protective clothing, the announcement went on, they could have been much closer to ground zero. The men were then ordered to turn around as the countdown continued. At 7:25 a.m. precisely, the order was given, bomb away. John DeBusk, who is wearing the dark glasses in the far left of this photo, recalled that those without eyewear could see the bones in their hands as they placed them over their faces at the moment of explosion. The ground, another witness recalled, was running at you like a roller coaster. Seconds passed, and the soldiers were directed to pivot once more and face the fireball. So this was the 9th such device detonated at the Proving Grounds, which was less than a year old, and had yet to acquire its more familiar name, the Nevada Test Site. But the 21-kiloton Dog was different. After an interval deemed suitably lengthy, nearly 900 of those soldiers attacked an objective about 500 yards from ground zero in a tactical troop maneuver, while 60 men moved yet closer to the site of the airdrop detonation to conduct so-called damage effects tests. This was the first such troop test exercise on land, a formal demonstration of atomic warfare. The premise was that the American military, driven back to the US Southwest by two invading armies, was forced to use an atomic bomb to clear a path into enemy-held territory. And both of these enemies were understood to follow the typical formations and current doctrines of communist armies. Sometimes, the investigative journalist Eileen Wellsome says of this and other such scenarios, soldiers were lost in the dust and the wind, driven off course, only to find themselves dangerously close to the scorched center of the blast. Now, these exercises, as many of you will know, had a name, Desert Rock. From 1951 to 57, through the sets of tests named Buster Jangle, Tumbler Snapper, Upshot Knothole, Teapot, and Plumb Bob, a total of 8 Desert Rock initiatives involving tens of thousands of personnel were staged at the Nevada test site. As Peter Hales writes, while the poetics of atomic tests may have originated in the desire to confuse to disguise, the names conveyed reassurance as well. These unimaginably destructive, world-threatening weapons hidden behind whimsical, mundane forms. Who, he says, could fear Teapot Apple? Of course, as he also notes, the implications of using names like Red Wing Navajo, part of a long and sordid history of native nomenclature in the US military, is rather ironic given the multiple misfortunes suffered by southwestern indigenous communities, including the Navajo Nation, as a result of the atomic age. So Desert Rock participants are some of the most prominent atomic veterans, a group whose numbers are dwindling, but who continue to advocate for recognition and restitution. Just a few weeks ago, the Ottawa Citizen published a story on the Atomic Veterans exhibit that had been added to their very standard, rather boring Cold War section of the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa. I haven't seen this yet, but I'm interested to check it out. From formal oral histories and memoirs to idiosyncratic personal websites, the recollections of Desert Rock attendees amount to a vivid, often distressing portrait of life in the maelstrom of Cold War militarization. These GI guinea pigs, as they called themselves, well before anti-nuclear activists took up their cause, have received substantial attention from advocates, scholars, photographers, and journalists. Their stories remain compelling, but what I want to focus on today is one sentence uttered during another exercise Desert Rock, the 5th to be precise, in April 1953. This is a year and a half after DOG, a period averaging roughly a test per month in Nevada. And by this point, the Department of Defense had essentially convinced the Atomic Energy Commission to abandon its safety guidelines at the proving grounds, for soldiers at least. Their distance from ground zero had been drastically reduced, the tolerable amount of radiation increased, and the time before marching toward the mushroom cloud shortened to nothing, essentially. For the first time in known history, the Desert Rock commander wrote in a personal message to participants, "Troops successfully attacked toward ground zero immediately following the explosion." "You can remember with a sense of pleasure and accomplishment," he continued, "that you were a real pioneer in experimentation of the most vital importance to the security of the United States." And this sentence, with its ambiguous structure, invites us to contemplate the word experimentation in multiple ways. As the name itself suggests, the proving grounds was an experimental space. And some of these experiments, as we know, were conducted with cameras. But alongside the bombs themselves were the soldiers who became experimental subjects for the military human sciences. And this last form of experiment acts as a reminder. Despite its unique status as a setting for war beneath the bomb, the proving grounds was in other respects far from exceptional. It was one of a lengthy list of locations, many within the continental United States, for the study of military bodies under extreme environmental conditions. And this, I suppose, is my version of the extended exhibition that John invited at the outset. To come to grips with this larger geography, we need to return for the preparations of DOG. By the middle of the 20th century, an ad hoc bureaucracy had emerged to address the medical and radiation research problems of atomic warfare. And not coincidentally, the timing was identical for the consideration of civil defense. In a November 1950 meeting, representatives from the Pentagon and the AEC debated the need for human experimentation. A man named James Cooney, an Army Brigadier General, a radiologist, and member of the AEC's Division of Military Applications, suggested at this meeting that if the use of tactical nuclear weapons has now gone beyond the realm of possibility and into the realm of probability, then commanders required information. Quote, "How much radiation can a man take?" And I wish I could find a photo of him. He seems to be somewhat of a hidden Cold War figure. I'll keep looking. But as Eileen Wellsome writes in her excellent book, The Plutonium Files, Cooney's career advanced, quote, "with the thunderous crack of each atomic detonation." In a speech in 1948, reflecting his experiences at Operation Crossroads and Sandstone in the Marshall Islands, he described the, quote, "fear reaction of the uninitiated soldier as appalling. We must," he went on, "acquire a practical attitude toward this piece of ordnance." Now, there was significant opposition, but by the time of the first Nevada nuclear test, just 2 months after that 1950 meeting, Cooney's position, or at least his ambition, had prevailed. For a start, the AEC had launched a sophisticated PR campaign designed to make the atom routine in the continental US and make the public feel at home with atomic blasts and radiation hazards. And the Pentagon, left out largely of the hastily assembled Los Alamos Run show that was the initial round of tests, began to press for additional military involvement, which, after all, was at a former Air Force bombing and gunnery range. And the specific language of this Pentagon appeal is significant. Indoctrination in essential physical protective measures under simulated combat conditions and observations of the psychological effects of an atomic explosion are reasons for this desired participation. Subsequent correspondence conveyed the intent to maneuver in the vicinity of ground zero as soon as practicable and to inject the maximum possible realism into the exercise. Now, although the plan to, quote, "advance over the area neutralized by the explosion," as it was intriguingly described in the original memo, bore little resemblance to the AEC's own safety guidelines, the request cannot have been entirely surprising, and permission was granted just 2 weeks later, with the double caveats that the Commission took no responsibility for the health or the provisioning and accommodation of visiting troops. The Pentagon's response was to create its own community on the edge of the proving grounds, Camp Desert Rock. According to a Department of Defense film about the first Desert Rock exercise, quote, "in a land where lizards and sandflies are the only living things, a tent city now stands." As you can see, it was soon made much more substantial. Reflecting on these sorts of media representations, Peter Hales has suggested that Desert Rock introduced Americans to atomic spectacles set in the larger, familiar mythos of the American West. Gordon Dean, chairman of the AEC in the early 1950s, famously called the proving grounds a good place to throw used razor blades. All of this wasteland discourse, as we know from the work of Valerie Kulitz and others, cleared the way for the militarization of the Desert West, or what Kulitz calls nuclear colonialism. "We are now," she quotes the Western Shoshone chief Raymond Yowell, "the most bombed nation in the world." Meanwhile, Camp Desert Rock was both a site of industrious adventure and an educational space where visitors received much of the indoctrination desired by their superiors. Indoctrination designed to familiarize soldiers with nuclear war. As early as 1950, a pamphlet on atomic energy indoctrination dismissed the danger of lingering radioactivity, suggesting instead that an unreasoning fear would result in an unnecessary toll in American lives. Indoctrination has a sinister ring today, and its Cold War association with mind control and brainwashing, a discussion that grew feverish during the Korean War, meant that a great deal seemed to depend on who exactly was doing the indoctrinating. And yet within the military, the word has long been treated rather offhandedly as a synonym for education, reflecting its Latin root. But in its delivery, indoctrination, military indoctrination, is essentially unidirectional. It implies the overhaul of a human subject upon arrival in a new environment. Soldiers at or destined for the proving grounds were understood to require this reconfiguration before the jarring experience of a test, an experience, it should be stressed, that was not voluntary. But whether this indoctrination was successful or not, and there is plenty of evidence to suggest that for many it was not, the proving grounds and other locations that it could stand in for became spaces for the proper execution of violence. The uncertainty surrounding the efficacy of this education and training and the experimental identity of the site more broadly also inspired the military to fold biomedical tests into desert rock activities. Recall that second rationale for heightened military action at the proving grounds: observations of the psychological effects of an atomic explosion. So a systematic research study would inform, or as it turned out, simply justify, future indoctrination. To conduct this study, the Pentagon did not turn to an established institution, but to a brand new army contractor, firmly perched, as Joy Rohde writes, within an ill-defined gray area between academia and the national security state. The Human Resources Research Office, or HUMRO, was established by the Pentagon at George Washington University in 1951 to conduct work in the military human sciences, performance, motivation, training, morale, but also psychological warfare and man-machine systems. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, the HUMRO questionnaires handed out during Desert Rock 1 were riddled with errors, and the conclusions, according to a Pentagon review the next year, were highly indeterminate and unconvincing. But HUMRO was certainly invited to conduct a second study at the 1952 Desert Rock exercise during Operation Tumbler Snapper. The most significant change seemed to be a reduction in the distance of soldiers from ground zero, a search for a threshold of intolerability, as it was put. Again, the results were questionable, but the Pentagon's research board pressed on. Quote, "Psychological evaluation is difficult, and results can be expected to appear superficially trivial, but the matter is of such importance that the research should be persisted in, utilizing every opportunity." Later HUMRO research included activities such as obstacle courses and crawling over contaminated ground. The methodology, it seems, was less important than the premise. And when I read about these flawed, even somewhat preposterous HUMRO experiments, I was reminded of an image from another military landscape. The walk-around sleeping bag, as it was called, produced by the U.S. Air Force's Arctic Aeromedical Laboratory in Alaska, part of the lab's, shall we say, broad interest in the North as a space for survival and combat. And this lab's work in the human sciences, like that conducted concurrently through the 1950s at the Nevada Proving Grounds, ranged from the ridiculous to the injurious. Likewise, the two sites, and I've argued that the Alaskan institution effectively treated the entirety of Alaska as a kind of laboratory, shared strikingly similar research interests. War under arduous environmental conditions, firstly, but also protective clothing and equipment, vision, morale and motivation, and the Aeromedical Laboratory in Alaska additionally conducted radiation studies on both soldiers and indigenous Alaskans. Meanwhile, southeast of Fairbanks, at a vast tract of land known as Big Delta, the U.S. Army established an Arctic training center, home to an Arctic indoctrination school, a training company, and a test and development section. During the 1950s, as tens of thousands of soldiers from around the country passed through Desert Rock, a smaller but similarly diverse cohort, perhaps 5,000, graduated from the Alaskan Indoctrination School. Summing up the lessons learned at this latter location, one official Army history suggested that soldiers have learned how to live with, not to resist, the northern climate and terrain. Various activities were, quote, valuable proving grounds for men as well as equipment. In a dispatch from another equivalent Air Force facility in Nome, Alaska, Hanson Baldwin, a prominent military correspondent of the New York Times, wrote that the school was helping to eliminate dread of the Arctic, the unreasoning psychological bugaboo that hampers personnel efficiency and military operations in Alaska. Whether in Nevada or Alaska, these schools for indoctrination were sites for the making and sharing of narratives about the possibility and probability of war in such landscapes. The nuclear desert, the frozen north, these became caricatured regions with both imaginative power and physical substance, where life expressed as survival, however compromised, is inseparable from violence. And this network of dispersed but entangled sites that I've started to gesture to here was brought into view in a 1952 episode of The Big Picture, the influential U.S. Army-produced television program on ABC. Each airing of this show began with a stern and sweeping geographic supposition. Quote, "From Korea to Germany, from Alaska to Puerto Rico, all over the world, the United States Army is on the alert to defend our country, you, the American people, against aggression." But episode 208, Tools for a Modern Army, was concerned only with locations on U.S. soil, sites devoted to the production of knowledge that sustained this global presence. Following footage of desert rock maneuvers at the Nevada test site, a narrator explained that global war means fighting in every kind of climate on every kind of terrain. He then took viewers swiftly from Maryland's Aberdeen Proving Ground and White Sands, New Mexico, to the Indoctrination and Testing Center at Big Delta, Alaska, which provided some very nice imagery of snowshoe-clad troops struggling against a harsh wind. Finally, the documentary turned to Arizona's Yuma Test Station, where the Army's Quartermaster Corps was studying experimental uniforms and items of equipment in relation to the intense heat. All of these places, albeit often under different names, still exist today, and their purpose endures too. In Alaska, Nevada, and elsewhere, the double claim of isolation and insignificance has justified and made easier the consolidation of tremendous military power. Or what Rob Nixon calls, clearly if a little bluntly, the forcible imposition of an official landscape over a vernacular one. Referring to Solnit's stirring study of the Nevada test site and its uninhabitants, Nixon describes, quote, "people who have been turned into ghosted casualties of a federal project of imaginative self-enclosure that concealed them from view." But while Solnit and Nixon and many others have sought to sensitively repopulate such evacuated spaces with lives, narratives, and memories, questions as to the making of these official landscapes remain. Thanks very much.
Thank you for your talk. I have a question for Derek regarding the drone papers that were released recently by The Intercept. I want to know what you think the kind of impact of these revelations will be, both on your research and in kind of our broader understanding of drone warfare.
Thanks very much. Is this on? Yeah. It was a question about the drone papers. I haven't had a chance to work through them in great detail yet. What I can say is that there have been two reactions that I've detected so far. Those who are proponents of drones insist that this tells us nothing we didn't know already. And other commentators have argued that it tells us much more than we knew before. From what I've read so far, my own view is somewhere between the two. I think it tells us a considerable amount, as it happens, about the space over which drones operate and the sheer difficulty in fulfilling the promise of the manufacturers of the Predators and the Reapers. In other words, what they claim is persistent presence. General Atomic's slogan is dwell, detect, destroy. And the notion is that you can do all three from the same platform. But it turns out that that is compromised because of the limited operating range of the drone. So that there's been considerable difficulty in maintaining the unblinking eye over the Horn of Africa and elsewhere. I'm not surprised at that, because the fact of the matter is drones today have a remarkably short operating range. They can be controlled from the United States, but they have to take off and land close to the theatre of operations. They're also very slow and they're very sluggish. That's why the idea that this somehow turns the world into a global battlefield, I think, is much more complicated than most of the critics seem to realize. What we really need to know much more about, though, I think, is what's happening in Pakistan, and the drone papers are more or less completely silent about that. They do also usefully remind us that the major locus for targeted killing by the United States is none of those places. It's been Afghanistan.
Throughout the day, the thing that's been looming larger and larger and was pinpointed when I spoke to Blake Fitzpatrick about the municipal response to what's going on in that city is the issue of denial. And I realize this is an oblique question, but you've introduced me to a literature that I wasn't familiar with, Derek, and I appreciate it. Is there a parallel literature on the madness of denial that accompanies everything we've been hearing today?
It depends what you mean by literature, I suppose.
Research?
Oh, yes, there is. I mean, Matt can speak much more about, in fact, Matt can speak about atomic testing and nuclear war in ways that I simply can't. But one of the most interesting things I think about the use of the drone is that the United States Air Force says that it gives them the unprecedented ability to put warheads on foreheads. In other words, to target individuals. So whenever I talk about drones, people always say to me, but come on, you know, this isn't Dresden. This is not firebombing Hamburg or Cologne, as though that's the kind of moral standard we should be setting ourselves. But this capacity actually works its way out through a public discourse which on the one hand celebrates surgical strikes, but secondly removes bodies from the field of view. So we have these curious surgical operations which are taking place without a body. And that seems to me the locus of the most significant denial that takes place. It's what James Dederian calls virtuous war. But Matt, I'm sure, has much more to say about atomic war.
I think just in reading about what was happening at the test site, there were all sorts of obfuscations and just a lot of messy behavior which can then be used to hide behind in some ways. So for instance, some of the activities that were being conducted vis-a-vis the soldiers are described as purely occupational. It's very difficult to think about soldiers as exploited subjects of human radiation experiments when they are simply following orders. And so this whole question of, you know, who is a volunteer for an experiment, for instance, is impossible in some ways to address, and that's been a real challenge for the atomic veterans. And the other thing seems to be sort of people literally not getting the memo that even when different kinds of orders are coming from the Pentagon, perhaps as a result of publicity or other sorts of pressures, that they don't seem to trickle down to the test site, or they don't trickle down for a very long time. And so things continue and continue and continue, and they seem to gather their own momentum even when it's very clear that they're not providing any useful evidence, whatever you'd call that. So.
Could I just add something to that? Because one of the differences when we move to drone operations, I think, is that the US media and beyond, and remember that Canada operates drones too. I mean, it leased them from Israel for its operations over Afghanistan, for example. One of the juiciest stories as far as the US media has been concerned is that, in a sense, drone pilots and sensor operators are exploited subjects because the drone relies on full motion video, and the latest iteration of that is high definition full motion video, which means that they can see in the most extraordinary detail what it is they've done. So that precisely unlike Cologne or Hamburg or Dresden, where you were bombing at night, or where you moved in fast and moved off fast, the drone is required to remain on station to carry out what they call a battle damage assessment. And so crews can see in the most extraordinary detail now what it is that they've done. So bodies appear in their field of view. But the story in the US press is precisely about the PTSD suffered by drone pilots and operators. And there's no discussion of the bodies that appear in the crosshairs or of the PTSD suffered by those who have to live under drones in Pakistan and Yemen and Somalia and elsewhere.
Thanks, Derek. Just to follow up on from exactly that point, what appears in the imaginary kind of sinister is that real-time, detailed ability to evaluate the target and then confirm the kill. But I want to point out what might be a tiny omission, although it was alluded to in one of the slides, is the difference between that real-time drone warfare and what was very heavy in the imagination in the 1980s is of the cruise missile being a fully robotic drone that had a very different latency where it was given instructions and the cruise missile makes its own judgments. It chooses its own flight path. It can operate in gray skies. And I just wonder where, again, it is about trading off, different kinds of bads, but I just wonder if you have any comments about that. And again, the slide that suggested drones were a way around a treaty that likely was about the cruise missile. And yeah, any general comments there?
Yeah, the general one, to be very quick, is that, of course, cruise missiles have been used by the United States to carry out so-called targeted killing in Yemen. They've been launched from ships offshore. But it's quite clear that their preferred means of carrying out targeted killing, other than special forces on the ground, which have also been responsible for many more than ever appear in the public record, is the drone. But the point about the grey skies is that drones are not only slow and very difficult to maneuver, which is why you can only use them against people who can't fight back. You can only use them in undefended airspace. You couldn't send a Predator or a Reaper over Russia or China because it would be shot down in a millisecond. So you can only use these over, as I say, people who can't fight back. But they're vulnerable to weather. So cloud, for example, has caused endless numbers of drones to crash in the Horn of Africa and elsewhere. So, I mean, you're quite right about cruise missiles, but it's this ideology of putting warheads on foreheads, and it's this process of the individuation of war, which is, I think, a significantly new dimension of later modern war. It hasn't replaced all of the others, but it's sufficiently new, and that is, of course, radically different from... Oh, I see. Yeah. No, I think that's right, but I've nothing to add to that. I mean, the point about all of this, though, is that when you talk to the people who are involved in operating these kinds of systems, they all say that the one thing you don't have in war is time, and that problem has actually accelerated. So if you look at the detailed conduct of drone strikes in Afghanistan, which is what I have done, what you find is that there's so much information zipping around now at faster and faster speeds. These full motion videos are being distributed all over the place, that in fact, far from making it easier to know what's going on, it actually becomes much, much more difficult, because you've got these video feeds being seen in the continental United States, you've got them being seen at Combined Air Operations Center at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, and you've got them being seen at command posts in Afghanistan. And there are simply too many people with eyes on what's happening, too many voices through the microphone. They're all seeing different things, interpreting the situation differently. So there's a different kind of latency there. And it's not necessarily a, quote, improvement over the cruise missile.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Matt and Derek, both. It's great talks. I was curious, and this might be casting a bit of a wide net, but something I was thinking of during both of your talks is kind of the role of landscape in both of these scenarios. And Derek, I know you've written something kind of recently about like landscapes and warfare and the jungle and the desert as stages of pure war and unknowability, respectively. But I'm curious too how the Arctic might play into this as an inhospitable location, but also the desert and Nevada as both kind of orientalized landscapes, but also landscapes of kind of pure war and flat space. That might be too broad, but I was just curious.
I mean, I know that some geographers dismiss that word or that concept a little bit. It's a bit old-fashioned. I love it simply just because of the combination of materiality and imagination that goes into making a landscape. But, you know, one of the reasons I started all this was because I discovered some, a rather modest little agency that the Air Force created in the Second World War called the Arctic Desert Tropic Information Center. And it was essentially created, and it lasted right through the 50s as well, and sort of took on different projects. It was very interested in questions of survival, which is a whole other issue, but, you know, created to kind of understand the landscapes in which the Air Force in this case, but the military more generally, found itself during the 1940s and 50s. And of course, this required not just the sort of direct study of these places as they actually existed on the ground, but the recreation of those places in all sorts manner of formal and informal simulations and other kinds of imaginative discussions. And so there's a way in which a kind of very active global form of military geography is being produced during this period that does span these different kinds of landscapes, and it requires an understanding of the Arctic or the desert as a very sort of homogeneous entity, a place that requires significant skill in the soldier who is kind of inculcated or indoctrinated into setting foot in these spaces in order to both survive but also, of course, to defeat both natural and cultural foes at the same time. And I think that combination of nature and culture is so powerful.
The only other quick thing to add, since you mentioned Orientalism, is that in both cases, quite clearly the targets are orientalized. So if you look at Michael Sherry's The Rise of Armageddon, he talks about the way in which the use of the atomic bomb over Hiroshima and Nagasaki was rationalized and indeed prepared for long in advance by the racialization of the Japanese as not only being not people like us, but not really people at all. And you find exactly the same argument being used in Pakistan, in Yemen, and Somalia, and elsewhere. So that is a dismally common trope to both.
I have another question for Derek, and I guess I'd be curious to, for you. I'd just like to hear more about how you understand the particular value of continuity in this case. So, say not Joseph Masco's presentation notwithstanding, perhaps like what is it that you understand as particularly urgent in actually forging a certain understanding of continuity rather than the emergence of something new or different?
The two dodgy answers are to say that this is highly preliminary, and that secondly, this is what I was asked to do. But there is a more thoughtful answer, and the more thoughtful answer is this, that there's been a great deal of work exploring the genealogy of drone warfare today. And much of that goes back to the wars over Bosnia and Herzegovina. Some of it goes back to Vietnam and the use of drones over North Vietnam for reconnaissance. And some goes back even further to experiments round about the time of the First World War. Now, as it happens, I think that long genealogy is important because what it reveals is precisely that gavotte between secrecy and transparency that Joe was talking about. In other words, that which is exposed to the public is exposed deliberately and knowingly. And in those different settings, essentially a public is being told, you may see this. But what is not being told is that you may see this on condition that you don't see that. And what emerges through that genealogy, I think, is two crucial dimensions which are relevant to connecting nuclear war to drone warfare, for all the differences between them. And one is the very obvious attempt to render military violence as a scientific technical achievement, so that it's about inducing a sense of awe, not simply as Rumsfeld intended, amongst the subject target population of Baghdad, but within, in this case, the American public. And that sense of spectacle actually starts at the very beginning. So 2 or 3 years before the First World War, a theatre in London was filled night after night by a man who had a remote-controlled airship. And every single night, this airship would float out over the audience. And then when he moved a lever on the stage, paper birds would fall from the airship. And he told his audiences night after night after night that in the real world, they could be bombs. And he could sit at his desk in London and drop bombs on, and the list is really quite bizarre, Manchester, Paris, or Berlin. Now, the inclusion of Manchester is interesting because, of course, that immediately raises all sorts of questions about navigation and intelligence and your ability to know where you are in the world at any one time. But you can see that's a spectacle which is being arranged for a public audience. So I think that genealogy is important because I think it's a mistake to assume that this gavotte between secrecy and transparency is somehow unique to the post Second World War period. The other quick thing I would say is that throughout that genealogy of drones, I've seen no discussion anywhere of the way in which drones were instrumental in the ways that I tried to sketch out here. It came as a surprise to me.
Could I just add, I mean, I think geographers in general, and it's not entirely true in other disciplines, but we essentially, with certain prominent exceptions, we essentially discovered the United States military, at least those working in a rather critical bent, discovered the United States military after 9/11. I mean, there was very, very little scholarship on the subject on this tremendously powerful institution with this long genealogy that Derek describes. And I mean, I think it goes back to Joe's point about the relationships back to the nuclear state, to the military-industrial complex, however you wish to describe it. But those deep connections are so significant in this kind of rush to consider the latest and greatest. We ought not to forget that, especially when I think about the embeddedness of some of these institutions, some of these laboratories, some of these proving grounds that have been there for decades and decades and decades, reconfigured, renamed, expanded, not very often reduced, but still there.
Unfortunately, I have the mic. Hello. Thank you. I want to ask another question in the way of distance. The satellites that feed the GPS systems, that feed the navigation of the drones, where there's another battle going on that we do not see. And there's tests that go on in the way of the distances the satellites can carry images back and forth, as well as to how long and how far they can rotate and at what speed and all that other stuff. Can you please comment on what you know in the battle up there, please, and thank you.
Actually, can I answer a different question? Well, I want to answer the different question because there's a great deal of discussion out there about the role of satellite imagery and the part that it plays in modern war. But if you're going to operate a drone, that actually isn't the crucial thing at all. It doesn't matter. The crucial thing is satellite communications. And satellite communications are vital, even with that fiber optic cable under the Atlantic. And they're important in two ways. They're important, firstly, because the demands for bandwidth, as the number of combat air patrols goes up, a combat air patrol is basically 4 drones. Because if you're going to have persistent presence over any one location, you need 4 drones to guarantee that, because they're so slow. You've got to have 1 traveling there, you've got 1 on station, you've got 1 returning, and the 4th is always out for maintenance. But even so, as the number of combat air patrols has gone up to, I think, 65 currently, or some number like that, together with all the other drones and all the other demands for imagery that's being generated within the US military, the pressure on bandwidth is so great that it can only be fulfilled by commercial satellites. There are not enough military satellites to fulfill those demands. And even then, you can only transmit those images if they're degraded. If you actually transmit them with the full fidelity that the manufacturers promise, then the whole system collapses. So the quality of imagery which arrives at different sites is radically different depending on where you are, and all kinds of technologies are required to reconstitute them. So it's not the case that it's giving you this pristine imagery, either to fly the thing or for analysts to look at. And the second quick thing to say, therefore, is that Obama's pivot to the Pacific turns out to be a peculiarly difficult vow to fulfill, because the satellites that it uses presently for its operations in the so-called Greater Middle East, including Afghanistan and Pakistan, the commercial deals are all in place. But who do you think owns most of the satellites orbiting the Pacific? The answer is China.